haunted by visions. The first dream came the night after Alex escaped the hidden room. It began innocuously, with fragmented images of the castle, stone hallways that twisted in impossible directions, their paths looping endlessly. He felt weightless, drifting through the labyrinth without control, as though the castle itself were guiding him. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of damp stone and iron. Then the vision changed. The chapel materialized before him, bathed in an unnatural red light. Figures in hooded robes stood in a circle, their heads bowed in reverence. At the center of the group was an altar, and on it lay a man, his wrists and ankles bound with frayed rope. The man's screams echoed through the stone walls as one of the robed figures raised a blade high above his head. Alex wanted to cry out, to stop the horrific scene unfolding before him, but his voice was paralyzed. He could only watch as the blade came down, severing the man's throat in a single brutal motion. Blood gushed onto the altar, pooling in grooves carved into the stone. The red liquid traveled along the channels, flowing outward to a massive circular engraving on the floor, the same Ouroboros symbol Alex had seen in the hidden room. As the blood reached the edges of the symbol, the air vibrated with a deep, guttural hum. The hooded figures chanted in a language Alex couldn't understand, their voices rising in a crescendo. And then the light shifted, dimming as a shadow emerged from the engraving. The Watcher's arrival. The shadow coalesced into a figure, tall and gaunt, with elongated limbs and glowing red eyes. It was the same entity Alex had encountered in the hidden room, but here in the dream, it felt larger, more real. Its presence radiated malice, the air growing colder with each step it took toward the altar. The hooded figures stepped back, their chants slowing as the creature loomed over the lifeless body. With an almost reverent motion, it reached down, its clawed hand dipping into the pool of blood. The liquid seemed to writhe under its touch, as though alive. Then, its head turned, and its burning eyes locked onto Alex. In that instant, Alex felt as though his soul had been laid bare, every thought and memory exposed to the creature's gaze. The sheer intensity of the connection overwhelmed him, and he woke with a jolt, drenched in sweat. Sleepless nights. Alex sat up in bed, his chest heaving as he struggled to calm his racing heart. The room was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of his flashlight on the desk. The events of the dream replayed in his mind, the screams and chants echoing in his ears. He told himself it was just a nightmare, a product of stress and exhaustion. But the vividness of the images, the way the creature had looked at him, it felt real. Sleep was impossible after that. Alex spent the rest of the night pacing the room, flipping through the diary and his notebook in search of answers. But the cryptic language and fragmented accounts only deepened his unease. When dawn finally arrived, Alex felt no relief. The sunlight seemed weak, unable to penetrate the gloom that clung to the castle. The second dream. The following night, the dreams returned. This time, Alex found himself in a medieval banquet hall, its long table laden with food and drink. Candles flickered in iron chandeliers above, their flames casting dancing shadows across the walls. At the head of the table sat a man in ornate armor, his black hair slicked back, and his piercing eyes filled with authority. Alex recognized him immediately. Vlad Tepes. Vlad raised a goblet, his lips curling into a cruel smile. Around him sat his court nobles, soldiers, and advisors, all watching him with a mix of reverence and fear. But something was wrong. The air in the hall was heavy, the candles flickering unnaturally. The faces of the courtiers began to blur, their features twisting into grotesque shapes. Vlad stood, his voice booming. "Tonight, we feast not on flesh, but on power. Let the court bear witness to my ascension." Alex's gaze was drawn to the far end of the hall, where a robed figure carried a chest toward the table. It was the same box Alex had seen in the hidden room, the bloodstone glowing faintly within. The room darkened as Vlad placed his hand on the stone, his expression one of triumph. But then the shadows deepened, and the Watcher emerged once more. The screaming victims. The scene shifted violently, and Alex found himself in a different part of the castle, a dungeon, its walls slick with moisture and streaked with blood. The air was thick with the stench of decay. Victims lined the walls, their wrists and ankles shackled in iron chains. They writhed and screamed, their voices raw with agony. Hooded figures moved among them, their hands stained crimson as they collected the victims' blood in wooden bowls. In the center of the dungeon was a massive pit, its edges lined with jagged rocks. A faint red glow emanated from within, pulsing in rhythm with the victims' screams. Alex felt himself drawn toward the pit, his feet moving against his will. As he peered over the edge, he saw it, a writhing mass of shadows and blood, its form constantly shifting. The Watcher's face appeared within the chaos, its eyes locking onto Alex once again. He stumbled back, his ears ringing with the sound of the victims' cries. Awakening in terror, Alex awoke with a gasp, his heart hammering in his chest. His room was dark, but the sense of being watched lingered. He fumbled for his flashlight, shining it into the corners of the room, half expecting to see the gaunt figure from his dreams. But the room was empty. He sat on the edge of the bed, his hands trembling. The dreams weren't just nightmares. They felt like memories, as though he were reliving the castle's darkest moments. By the third night, Alex dreaded falling asleep. He had spent the day scouring the diary and the books from the library, hoping to find something, anything, that could explain the visions. But the texts were maddeningly vague, filled with cryptic references to the Bloodstone and the veil between worlds. When exhaustion finally overtook him, the dreams were waiting. This time, he found himself in the castle's great hall, the same space where he had first met Mihai. But it was different now, grander, with ornate tapestries and flickering torches lining the walls. A procession of hooded figures entered, carrying the Bloodstone on a pedestal. At their head was Vlad, his eyes alight with anticipation. He gestured toward the altar, where a young woman was bound, her face pale with terror. "No more shall we bow to death," Vlad declared, his voice echoing through the hall. "Tonight we claim eternity." The hooded figures began to chant, their voices deep and guttural. The Bloodstone pulsed with an intense light, casting the room in an eerie red glow. As the ritual reached its climax, the Watcher appeared once again, its shadowy form looming over the altar. The woman screamed as the creature's clawed hand reached for her, and Alex woke with a start, the sound ringing in his ears. The toll of the visions. Alex was no longer certain what was real and what was not. The line between waking and dreaming had blurred, the visions seeping into his consciousness even during the day. He saw flashes of the rituals in the corners of his mind, heard the faint echo of screams in the silence of the castle. His reflection in the mirror seemed different, his eyes darker, his face gaunt. He felt the castle pressing in on him, its ancient walls alive with secrets he couldn't yet comprehend. He knew one thing for certain. The dreams were not merely figments of his imagination. They were pieces of a puzzle, fragments of a story that the castle wanted him to understand. But what was the price of understanding? The village seer. The path to the village was shrouded in mist, the early morning light struggling to pierce through the low-hanging fog. Alex had left the castle before dawn, unable to shake the vivid images from his dreams. The weight of the Bloodstone and its horrors clung to him, a shadow that refused to dissipate. Mihai had mentioned the seer once, during one of his cryptic warnings. She lived at the edge of the village, he had said, near the woods where the locals seldom ventured. Though his tone had been dismissive, Alex remembered the undercurrent of fear in his voice. "She knows things," Mihai had muttered, but her words bring no comfort. Comfort was the last thing Alex wanted. He needed answers, and the diary's fragmented writings weren't enough. The seer's cottage. The village was eerily quiet when Alex arrived. The few villagers who were out stared at him with a mixture of curiosity and unease, their gazes lingering as he passed. A hunched old woman crossing the road made the sign of the cross, muttering under her breath. The seer's cottage was exactly where Mihai had said it would be, perched on the edge of a dark, gnarled forest that seemed to breathe with its own life. The cottage was small and dilapidated, its roof sagging under the weight of years. Herbs and dried flowers hung from the eaves, swaying gently in the cold breeze. Alex hesitated at the door, suddenly unsure of himself. The dreams, the bloodstone, the creature, they all felt unreal in the daylight. Was he losing his mind? Before he could second-guess himself further, the door creaked open. "You're late," a voice said from within. Alex blinked. "Late?" The voice didn't respond. Taking a deep breath, he stepped inside, meeting the seer. The interior of the cottage was dimly lit, the air thick with the pungent smell of incense and herbs. Shelves lined the walls, crammed with jars of powders and dried plants, animal bones, and trinkets. A single wooden table sat in the center of the room, its surface covered in candle wax, scattered tarot cards, and a dark, worn cloth embroidered with arcane symbols. Behind the table sat the seer. She was an old woman, her face lined with deep wrinkles that spoke of a hard life. Her eyes, however, were sharp and piercing, their dark depths gleaming with an unsettling awareness. She wore a faded shawl over her shoulders, and her hands, gnarled with arthritis, rested lightly on the table. "I've been expecting you," she said, her voice low and gravelly. Alex's mouth went dry. "You have." The seer gestured to the chair opposite her. "Sit." The seer's warnings. Alex sat down, his eyes darting around the room. He felt exposed, vulnerable, as though the seer could see straight through him. "You carry the castle's scent," she said, her nose wrinkling. "Its mark is upon you. Tell me, what have you touched?" Alex hesitated. "I found a stone, the bloodstone." The seer's expression darkened. "Fool," she spat. "That thing is not meant for mortal hands. It is a tether, a vessel of power and hunger. You have awakened it." The weight of her words settled heavily on Alex. "I didn't mean to," he said, his voice weak. "I just wanted to understand." "There is nothing to understand," she interrupted, her tone sharp. "The castle does not sleep, it waits. It watches. And now it has seen you." Alex leaned forward, desperation in his eyes. "What do I do? How do I stop it?" The seer regarded him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. "You cannot stop it," she said finally. "You can only leave. Abandon the castle, abandon your quest, and pray that it forgets you." A history of the castle's curse. Alex shook his head. "You don't understand. I've seen things, visions, rituals, sacrifices, the Watcher. What is it? What does it want?" The seer sighed, leaning back in her chair. "You have seen fragments, pieces of a story too old and too dark to comprehend. The Watcher is not of this world. It was called here by the Count and his blood court. Their arrogance, blinding them to the consequences of their actions. They thought they could control it, harness its power. But the Watcher is not a tool. It is a predator." She paused, her gaze growing distant. "The bloodstone is the key. It binds the Watcher to the castle, but it also feeds it. Every drop of blood spilled within those walls strengthens its hold. And now that you have touched it, you are part of its web. The talisman." Alex felt a chill crawl up his spine. "What happens if I stay? What happens to me?" The seer's piercing gaze locked onto his. "You will not leave the same. If you leave at all." She reached under the table, pulling out a small leather pouch. From it, she withdrew a talisman, a crude carving of an Ouroboros, made of blackened wood and strung on a frayed cord. She held it out to Alex. "Take this," she said. "It will not save you, but it may buy you time." Alex hesitated before taking the talisman, its surface rough and cold in his hand. "Buy me time for what?" "To leave," she said simply. "A final omen." The seer leaned forward, her voice dropping to a whisper. "But even this will not protect you if you return to the depths of that place. The bloodstone is awake now, and the castle will not let you go easily." Alex clenched the talisman tightly, its edges digging into his palm. "I can't just leave. There's something in that castle, something I need to understand." The seer's eyes narrowed. "Then you are a greater fool than I thought." She stood abruptly, her shawl billowing around her. "Go now. Leave this place while you still can. If you wait too long, Even I will not be able to help you. The journey back. Alex left the cottage with the talisman clutched in his hand, the seer's warnings echoing in his mind. The village was even quieter than before, the fog clinging to the streets like a shroud. As he walked back toward the castle, he felt the weight of the talisman against his chest. It brought a strange comfort, though he couldn't shake the feeling that it was merely a flimsy shield against something far greater than he could comprehend. The castle loomed in the distance, its dark silhouette framed by the rising sun. For the first time, Alex felt a pang of true fear, not just for himself, but for what he might uncover if he continued his search. But his curiosity was a hunger that would not be denied. The unseen force. The castle greeted Alex with its usual oppressive silence, broken only by the faint whistle of the wind slipping through the cracks in its ancient stone walls. He tightened his grip on the talisman the seer had given him, the rough wooden carving digging into his palm. Despite her dire warnings, the pull of the bloodstone was too strong to ignore. As he crossed the threshold into the main hall, Alex felt the weight of the castle settle on his shoulders, heavier than before. The air was different, charged with a static energy that raised the hairs on the back of his neck. He paused at the base of the grand staircase, his eyes scanning the dimly lit expanse. The tapestries on the walls fluttered faintly, though there was no breeze. A shiver ran down his spine as he heard it, a faint, rhythmic hum. It was coming from the hidden room, the pull of the bloodstone. Alex didn't remember making the decision to move, but his feet carried him toward the chapel almost involuntarily. His mind raced as he descended the stone steps that led to the secret passage. The seer's words replayed in his head, a chorus of warnings he was choosing to ignore. When he reached the concealed door, the seam was still visible from where he had left it slightly ajar. He hesitated, one hand on the rough stone. His breathing quickened as the faint hum grew louder, vibrating in his chest like a second heartbeat. The door groaned as Alex pushed it open, the sound reverberating through the passageway. The air beyond was colder, sharper, and carried that now familiar metallic tang. The hidden room lay ahead, the faint red glow of the bloodstone casting eerie, shifting shadows on the walls. The awakening room. The room hadn't changed, but it felt different, alive. The artifacts on the shelves seemed to watch him as he entered, their grotesque shapes catching the crimson light. The tools, the jars, the strange symbols on the walls, they all seemed more vivid, more present than they had before. And there, at the center of it all, was the bloodstone. The ornate box remained closed, but the stone's light pulsed faintly through the seams, its glow intensifying as Alex approached. The hum grew louder, a deep, resonant sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Alex felt the pull again, stronger this time. It wasn't just curiosity, it was compulsion, a magnetic force that urged him forward. Objects in motion. He stepped closer to the pedestal, his hands trembling. As he reached out to touch the box, something behind him shifted. Alex froze, his heart hammering in his chest. Slowly, he turned his head, his eyes scanning the room. A jar on one of the shelves tipped over and fell to the floor, shattering loudly. The viscous liquid inside oozed across the stone, filling the air with a pungent, rotting smell. Before Alex could react, another object, a rusted blade, slid off a nearby table and clattered to the ground. The sound echoed unnaturally, as if the room were amplifying it. "What the hell?" Alex whispered, his voice barely audible. The hum of the bloodstone grew louder, almost angry, and the objects in the room began to shift and move as if propelled by an unseen force. Jars rattled violently, books fell from their shelves, and the ancient tools slid across the stone floor. Alex stumbled back, his eyes wide with fear. "Stop it!" he shouted, his voice breaking. The room didn't listen. The force strikes. The energy in the room reached a fever pitch. The hum so loud that Alex clapped his hands over his ears. The bloodstone's glow pulsed faster, casting rapid flashes of red light that illuminated the carvings on the walls. Suddenly, Alex felt a sharp pressure on his chest. He gasped as he was shoved backward, his feet leaving the ground. He slammed into the wall with a force that knocked the air from his lungs. He struggled to breathe, his body pinned by an invisible force. His limbs refused to move, as though he were trapped in the grip of a giant, unseen hand. "Let me go," he choked, his voice strained. The pressure on his chest grew stronger, and for a horrifying moment, Alex thought his ribs might crack. The whispers began. Then came the whispers. At first, they were faint, indistinct murmurs that seemed to come from all around him. But as they grew louder, Alex realized they were speaking in a language he didn't understand. The words were guttural and harsh, filled with an ancient power that made his skin crawl. The whispers weren't just sounds. They were inside his head, burrowing into his thoughts like worms. Images flashed through his mind. The hooded figures from his dreams, the rituals, the Watcher emerging from the blood-soaked altar. The whispers grew frantic, overlapping and chaotic, until Alex thought he might lose his mind. The bloodstone reacts. The glow of the bloodstone reached its peak, bathing the room in an intense red light. The air vibrated with a deep, resonant tone that made the stone walls tremble. Alex felt the force holding him in place shift, dragging him forward. He was being pulled toward the pedestal, toward the bloodstone. "No," he shouted, his voice ragged. "I won't touch it." But the force didn't listen. His feet slid across the floor as he was dragged closer and closer to the glowing artifact. In a final act of desperation, Alex clutched the talisman around his neck. The rough would bit into his palm as he gripped it tightly, muttering a prayer to whatever force might be listening. The release. The effect was instantaneous. The whispers stopped abruptly, replaced by a deafening silence. The pressure on Alex's chest disappeared, and he collapsed to the floor, gasping for air. The bloodstone's glow dimmed, its hum fading into a low, sullen vibration. The objects in the room stilled, and the oppressive energy that had filled the space seemed to retreat. Alex lay on the cold stone floor, his body trembling. He clutched the talisman like a lifeline, his fingers aching from the force of his grip. The aftermath. After several minutes, Alex managed to sit up, his breaths coming in shallow gasps. The room was quiet now, eerily so, but the oppressive atmosphere remained. He glanced at the pedestal, where the bloodstone sat dormant once more. Its faint glow seemed almost mocking, as though it were waiting for him to make another mistake. Alex forced himself to his feet, his legs unsteady. He didn't dare touch the box again. Instead, he turned and fled, the weight of the talisman heavy against his chest. Back in the main hall, when Alex emerged into the main hall, he collapsed onto one of the wooden benches, his head in his hands. The castle seemed to sigh around him, its ancient walls settling back into their silent vigil. He thought of the seer's words. It does not sleep, it waits. The bloodstone wasn't just an artifact. It was alive, aware, and angry. Alex had disturbed something that should have been left buried, and he knew now that he was playing a dangerous game. But the visions, the whispers, the history trapped within the castle, they called to him. The allure of understanding the truth was stronger than his fear. Alex glanced at the talisman around his neck, its crude carving reassuring in its simplicity. He didn't know if it was enough to protect him, but it was the only defense he had. For now, it would have to do.